Let's just wait a couple minutes for everybody to join in.
Yeah.
Kevin, are we already on?
Yeah, it's already up and going.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the second episode of Faculty and Friends here at Kent State University College of Architecture and Environmental Design. Before we start, I want to thank the college and Dean Missouri for supporting this initiative. This is an initiative where we ask one of our faculty to invite a guest, someone that they can have a conversation with and a relationship to develop the research, someone that can help them and someone that they can actually develop this kind of like relationship in either academia or more importantly in professional practice as how they see the built environment and the research they're doing applied towards the built environment. Uh, I will introduce for tonight's session, we have Ebrahim Poustinchi. Ebrahim Poustinchi is an assistant professor here at Kent State University. He is the founder of RAD the Robotically Augmented Design Lab here at Kent State University, and the founding principal of Studio EP. Ebrahim's research focuses on the intersection of media and robotics, with an emphasis on an alternative reading of post-digital discourse through platforms, UI, UX, human-machine interaction, physical computation, and tangible interfaces. Ebrahim has widely lectured, taught workshops, and exhibited his work nationally and internationally, and his work has been disseminated in journals and conferences, galleries, museums, including the International Journal of Architecture Computation, Journal of Engineering Technology, Acadia, CADRIA, ECADS, CGRADI, ACSA, and the Museum of Moscow and beyond. One of the most interesting things about Ebrahim's bio is that he mentions that he's not only a designer but an inventor, and I know that he's in fact an inventor. He has many patents to his name, so that's amazing that we can count on someone like Ebrahim to be part of our staff. Moving on, I want to introduce Brendan Hall. Brendan Hall will be working in the function as a moderator in this platform, and he will go ahead and talk about the rules of engagement. Brendan Hall is a faculty again here at Kent State, teaching second year architecture studios and also some representation classes at the grad level.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Yeah, again, thank you to everyone who helped set this up. A lot of work behind the scenes as always, so thank you guys. And I'll get out of the way quickly. I'm really excited for this chat tonight and discussion. So just to kind of set up the rules for you guys who are working at home or who are listening in, those who are in the Zoom chat, in between when they are having their discussion, so we'll have two presentations and then a discussion. During that discussion, if you guys want to send me questions on the Zoom chat, you can send them to me privately, or you can post them onto the YouTube, and I will do my best to get as many of those read to these guys as possible. But again, super excited for this discussion and really excited to see what we have tonight. So I'll pass this off to Ebrahim, and thank you guys again.
Okay, awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Yvonne, for the kind introduction, and Brandon for moderating this session. So I would start by a quick introduction, and let me share a screen in a second. So I'm very excited and happy to, can you see my screen first of all? I should pass.
You're great.
Awesome. So I'm super excited to introduce our tonight's guest, lecturer Gilles Retsin. It is going to be a really exciting conversation, and I'm happy to introduce Gilles a little bit more for the conversation tonight. So Gilles is a Belgian architect currently based in London. He has studied international architecture in Chile, Belgium, and Architectural Association in London, where he graduated with distinction. He is an educator, architect, thinker, and I would say a theorist that looks at the intersection of digitality and how to bring the digital qualities outside of the computer in practice of architecture and producing built environment. Gilles' work and critical discourse has been recognized internationally and nationally through awards, lectures, and installations and showcasing in museums. His work has been on display at the Museum of Art and Design in New York, the Royal Academy of London, Centre Pompidou in Paris, and one of his recent projects, the installation at Tallinn Architectural Biennale, has caught an international recognition. He is the director of the architectural design program, a Master of Architecture at Bartlett, University College of London's Bartlett School of Architecture. And he is an author of two really important books, one being the book or the edition of Architectural Design magazine, the Discrete edition, which we're going to talk about more intensively and extensively. And he also co-authored a really important book, another really important book, I should say, Architecture and Automation, which is called Robotic Building, Architecture in the Age of Automation. So Gilles has initiated or has established his own practice a few years ago, I think 2013, if I'm correct, Gilles Retsin Architecture. And he's also a co-founder of R, a design collaborative that focuses on architecture and automation as platform. So this is more or less the informal, or actually the other way around, the formal introduction. So I wanted to quickly talk a little bit about the other sides on a personal comment I wanted to make on the work for today and the thing that we are going to talk about. So I think I wanted to focus on two distinguished themes that we're going to talk about today, mainly in the discussion part, which is the conversation about form and aesthetics, and it relates heavily to the discrete conversation that Gilles initiated. And I think it is a conversation that really is kind of belonging into the disciplinary kind of takes of architecture, from the part-to-part relationships and part-to-whole, where kind of everything is, in a sense, discrete. And then when it becomes the version or the reading that Gilles is proposing as discrete architecture, I think it brings in a heavy baggage of aesthetics and formal languages and formal agenda. So I think that is really interesting and super valuable in a sense that it is not only a disciplinary conversation and a fundamental construction oriented logic, but also heavily rooted in the aesthetics of the design and is a design oriented take. The other part, which hopefully we're going to have a little bit of touch base on it, is about the architecture and automation, which again, I think Gilles and his co-authors have extensively talked about in the robotic building book, which again is very interesting for me because it seems to become a conversation between UI and UX. So when we search Google search like a building automation, it seems to become more of an interface conversation. As we search for construction automation, I think it goes more towards the way that Gilles is proposing the automation and automated process of building buildings. So with those two, I just wanted to wrap up the introduction with a personal reading that I think Gilles is one of the very few from his generation that I would call post-screen, in a sense that he is taking the digitality out from the screen and bring it into the field. And he doesn't really live in a representational medium of a screen. And I would just summarize what I mentioned with a quick clip that I think shows this. Okay, so without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished guest for tonight, Gilles Retsin. Gilles, I think the stage is yours.
Thank you, Ebrahim. That's a wonderful thing. This video, like, it brings up so many questions. Like, that's probably one of the coolest introductions to a lecture ever. So that's great. Maybe first, while I'm kicking this off, a few words of thanks to Ivan, to Ebrahim, and to everyone at the school for making this possible. And although this is online, I feel very welcome in Ohio. So that's really fantastic. I also have to say, like, I really like the format that was chosen. That there's a conversation. I think that contributes something beyond kind of just a lecture. Like, and I personally already, Ebrahim and I met multiple times before to just discuss and hang out and kind of prepare for this session. And already that in itself was kind of a pleasure. So I'm just going to start my talk. I famously always go overtime with my talks, and I get into stress at the end and I skip half of my lecture. probably the same will happen tonight because we have 30 minutes, but I'll try to kind of do it. So the talk is split just in two parts. So one part is 2008 and one part is 2020. The 2020 part is very short, also because 2020, you know, just started. It has a lot of content, obviously, what happened in 2020, but it's much shorter. And obviously, both 2008 and 2020 are years of crisis. So maybe for the students who are too young to remember this, 2008 was a year of the financial crisis, the largest financial crisis, maybe until 2020. It was also the year that I graduated architecture school, officially kind of the worst year to graduate architecture school. Maybe 2020 is even worse. But that was kind of like a pivotal moment, I think, 2008, that defined and created a context for the work that now goes under the number of discrete. And 2020, in one way or another, I think only accelerates that work. So let's start in 2008. So when I graduated and kind of entered the market as a young student from graduating from Belgium, this was the work that I graduated with. So I was extremely, you know, this was the stuff we were looking at as students. We were obsessed by the digital. It was a very optimistic project where we were really, you know, hoping to enter practice and be able to, you know, build this kind of crazy things without kind of lots of constraints. And then, you know, in the kind of years following 2008, I found some kind of tried to maneuver the crisis. I ended up in Switzerland and managed to save a bit of money that allowed me to then go to the Architectural Association where I studied a master's. And then I, you know, continued kind of that research into the digital, this kind of optimistic project and this kind of relentless research into what the digital could be. But then at the same time, you know, then it was 2012, you know, the crisis was still there. The climate didn't really change. And suddenly, you know, as a kind of a group of people and also me personally, we were confronted with kind of a shortcoming of the digital. We started to become very critical of how we were educated and what we were looking at, you know, or kind of relentless search for like new formal ideas, for ever more resolution and complexities. And then we were confronted at the same time with this kind of radical crisis that was playing out in front of us. And like one of them, obviously, that would directly affect, you know, everyone in my generation. And also, I think in, you know, the generation here in the audience was the housing crisis, maybe best kind of, you know, illustrated by this meme, the famous avocado toast meme, where basically it kind of illustrates how, you know, millennials were accused of eating too much avocado toast and therefore you can't afford a house. And this kind of, you know, a kind of an impossibility in a way for our generation to even kind of dream about having access to housing. And at the same time, of course, while, you know, this kind of growing, I think, political and social consciousness was happening, at the same time, there was always also kind of a debunking happening of the early digital paradigm. And I think most famously with Mario Carpo's article, Breaking the Curve, which literally broke kind of the continuous paradigm and questioned that continuous paradigm as you know, as Greg Lynn and Zaha Hadid and Asymptote and kind of the early digital generation would advocate for. And kind of questioning that and making an argument that computation is actually discrete and that continuity is ultimately a kind of a modern technology that relies on mathematics and doesn't really rely on computation per se. And so at the same time, also while we have this kind of, you know, this kind of context of a growing kind of political and social questioning, you could also argue that the kind of dialectic that Greg Lynn set up here between, you know, the modernist curve that is on the top here, which is an assembly of universals, which is about parts and parts and wholes in a way, and then, you know, the kind of the continuous curve, which obviously gets rid of parthood and is just one curve, and there's no such thing as a part. That kind of dialectic between the digital and modernism also, you know, could be put into question. And at least, like, I think I put this kind of two images together. On the left is an image that the early digital generation used a lot. It's the Ford T factory, where you both see kind of an architectural project, but also an idea about production and labor that is based on seriality and universality. And then on the right, of course, the kind of most emblematic space of production of the 21st century, the Amazon warehouse, which essentially doesn't produce anything, but it's just a kind of a logistical project. And I think by putting these two images together, you also see that at least this dialectic between, what is digital and what was the modern project, that it's probably like not a real dialectic, that it's much more ambiguous, and that while, these two systems of production are radically, radically different, that at the same time, they also share a lot of properties. So the question was a little bit for this emerging generation that I'm a part of, if we could, again, begin to think about architecture as in relation to the world. And one way to do that is in a way to focus on the idea of production. And we can look, for example, at Siegfried Giedion, one of the theoreticians of, or historians of modernism, who wrote the seminal book Mechanization Takes Command, where mechanization is basically as a paradigm of production kind of driving also the modernist project. So could we replicate this today with kind of replacing maybe mechanization for the term automation, and by engaging with the term automation, begin to tackle a lot of questions that the early digital would not tackle, questions that relate to, on the one hand, to production, that relate to the building industry, that relate also to questions of labor, that relate to questions of inequalities emerging from the automation of labor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And just in itself, that's a very kind of relevant question to ask as well. And because of what you see in this little graph by The Economist, this is illustrating the productivity of the building industry, and you see that that actually has flatlined since 1947. That's actually from the United States, so that you could actually argue that since 1947, nothing fundamentally changed in the building industry, in our industry, despite all of the kind of inventions with BIM and 3 decades of research into the digital. Construction has essentially flatlined. And 1947 is the year that Le Corbusier started building l'unité d'habitation in Marseille, just to put that into context. So we could argue as well in this kind of dialectic relationship to modernism that actually, since 1947, nothing has actually even changed, right? Maybe we are still modern after all, right? And of course, that project is also interesting as a precedent because it also shows that you can talk about, social issues, you can talk about politics, you can talk about construction and production, but you can at the same time also talk about aesthetic agendas, and they don't exclude each other. And of course, we're mentioning a lot of times modernism here, kind of reappraising modernism. That's not to say that we don't have to be critical of all the problems associated with this model, problems of universality that are embedded in this model, which are deeply, deeply problematic, of course. So what I want to kind of do in this first part of the talk, the 2008 part, is trigger in a way, approach this question of automation first and foremost from a kind of creative question, from a question about design, aesthetics, authorship, etc., and kind of take a little bit to the work of my practice from that angle. And we could really kind of take that question about discreteness and about automation as a creative question, just as, when Colin Rowe, and I'm sorry to bring, Colin Rowe to this debate, I will only mention him once. So just as Colin Rowe set out, in this provocation on when he's comparing Le Corbusier's Villa Roche with Palladius' Villa Malcontenta, he sets out this kind of provocation and says that actually we have never been modern, that actually modernism is just a white version of Renaissance architecture, that it still relies on form function, on grids, on columns, on beams, etc., etc. And that is then a provocation that stirs in a way almost 40 years, I think, of research, driven with Eisenman and then Greg Lynn and next generation is questioning like what are kind of methods and techniques to potentially surpass kind of, first of all, become modern and then hopefully, abandon being modern. And of course, like, if we approach this from the question of parts, of course, architecture has always relied on parts, and I think Ebrahim used Google quite elegantly to illustrate that. Of course, we have always designed with parts, but we have never designed with parts in a digital way. We have not been avant-garde. We have not thought about parts as a kind of a digital project. It's always associated with a kind of project related maybe to typologies, to meaning, to syntax, to semantics, etc., etc. So could we actually, kickstart a new project for the digital that would not rely on continuity, but could we do that through digital thinking about parts, which then resulted, of course, in this issue of the discrete, which really brings together, and I think that's also an important point, which brings together a generation of people. So it's not just, I edited the issue, but the issue includes, in a way, a kind of a cross section of a generation of peers that are working on questions of discreteness, ranging from interfaces, to bring that also to the conversation, to buildings, to systems of production, to theory, to fully automated ideas of production. So my kind of journey there really started from taking that project that I did at the AA, which was in a way I think it's a very beautiful and very interesting project, but kind of trying to take that project and slowly push that into a world of discreteness, because like this was a project for a 3D printed house. It's in many ways the ultimate kind of continuity, the ultimate kind of extreme differentiation, where every single little part is differentiated. So the kind of practice started in a way by doing a number of competitions and trying to take in a way the same algorithm, but just begin to constrain it with 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 30 degrees, to kind of try to build up tectonics that can be clearly brought back to single parts. And so this was a project for the National Gallery in Budapest, a competition I kind of won together with shop architects, and then was excluded from when they figured out that I was 27 years old and operating as a kind of one-man band. And that project is really like Wolf Pricks called this series of projects sticks, like these are the stick projects. And it's effectively a series of discrete sticks that are kind of, assembled together into a kind of a canvas of horizontal strata. And it brings also, I think, a kind of introduces an almost kind of minimalist aesthetic as well to the digital, a very different kind of aesthetic than than continuity would argue for, almost a bit like you can see in this drawing by Agnes Martin, which is also kind of thriving on assembly and parted. Then the series of projects then kind of translated to, kind of progressively became more and more discrete and kind of more and more obsessed with this notion of the part. So this project Block Hut was an important one, where we kind of worked with a series of parts that you see here in red, which are kind of derived from single units, but yet are composed. So they're kind of customized zones that then you could plug a very boring, repetitive, serially repeating part in. And that would then give rise to, a kind of a completely new understanding of what seriality, modularity, and assembly could mean, right? So, previously we would associate this maybe with kind of 1950s cookie cutter repetition and a kind of an agenda of typologies and very objective and boring modernism. But in this case, we managed to kind of take the efficiencies that emerge from modularity and parts and kind of use those in a way for a very different agenda, where you just have a kind of a single repeating part that accumulates in this horizontal strata, and that then in a way give rise to kind of architecture that is assembled, yet also in one way or another organic, and can kind of really pushes this notion of assemblies. Then of course you can then also recycle this part for other projects, which is one of the great benefits of the discrete. You can be extremely lazy. You can repeat yourself continuously. I'll talk a bit about that later. I think that's a great advantage. To be a bit more precise, maybe about this kind of the difference between discrete and continuous. So it's a kind of, again, a dialectic that is in a way absurd, but I think deeply productive. I'm going to try to divide everything in architecture in either continuous or discrete. Of course, architecture is not either continuous or discrete, but it's a kind of a productive dialectic to play with. So you could say that the analog or the continuous, they're the same. It's basically a system that has no parts, that is continuously differentiated. So it's a system without units, like an analog clock, an analog watch, the digit or an analog signal, I mean in general. The digital then is always based on discreteness. So digital signals or digital systems are always based on discrete delineated units that are then assembled or compiled into signals. So what you see on the left is obviously a continuous architecture. It consists of, it's one whole, there are no parts. It can never be unfinished. It needs to be finished to this state and then it's finished forever. And it's an architecture with one part, right? There are no subparts. This is just one thing. And then what you see on the right is obviously a discrete architecture, not a digital architecture, although it looks like pixels, but it's a discrete architecture, Aldo van Eyck, which we can imagine that this thing can grow, it can contract, it can maybe be reassembled in another location. It can maybe be designed also by multiple authors in different instances, right? So these are completely kind of, dialectically opposed models to look at architecture, and these are obviously the extremes. This is a bit of a more kind of vulgar or playful comparison to understand continuity and discreteness. So if your parents gave you Legos to play with as a child, like normal parents do, then you would have you would be playing with a discrete and digital system. If your parents would have given you toothpaste to play with, to extrude little huts and domes, then you would have had very creative parents, but you would be operating in a continuous and analog world. So this robot 3D printing here is doing an analog and continuous activity. It's not a digital. This is not digital fabrication. This is analog fabrication using a robot. And this is a tricky one. This is an assembly of discrete bricks, but it's assembled in a continuous way where each brick derives its position from an overarching whole, and each brick has a continuous differentiation in its position. So this is actually a continuous project as well. This, on the other hand, is a discrete project. This is NASA having kind of little robots assembling Lego-like bricks together into structures that could become satellites and airplanes and other exciting things. So the kind of, the project that I kind of set out on was trying to, as a creative question, to question what would be an actually discrete architecture. So an architecture that has no typology, that has parts that have no function, that has no idea about overarching space, and that only in a way consists of a single repeating, pixel-like unit. What would that be, right? And it's an interesting creative question. I mean, in my generation, you could not do a blobby project or a project about curvature because that was done already, right? You could not compete with that. So also purely as a kind of a question, it's an interesting one. So this project, I think, is kind of emblematic in a way for the discrete. I think that's the one. It's a project from 2015 for a multifamily home in Belgium, which only consists of an L-shaped and a straight discrete part on 3 different scales. And I think this kind of really, in a way, communicates what a kind of discrete architecture could be, right? I mean, back then when I designed it, we didn't really know exactly yet how we were going to build this, but it set out an agenda that then, the practice kind of aggressively pursued to try to figure out how we can build this. And what we see is something that is, on the one hand, it's very excessive and exuberant, yet it's extremely controlled and rational and based on ideas about efficiencies. These are not solid blocks. They're actually hollow on the inside. They're made of, standard timber sheet materials that are assembled into these parts, and then these parts are assembled together into this kind of strata. It's also a deliberate provocation. Like it seems to kind of, it's kind of saying like, we're not interested in kind of, crazy curved atrium space or anything like that. This is a project that kind of deliberately articulates itself in horizontality, the most boring kind of architectural condition that you can imagine, because it doesn't matter. Like the project is not about kind of inventing kind of crazy spatial forms. This is a project that can thrive on boring types like tree slabs, for example. The project actually does not, and I will continuously do this kind of Freudian lapsus. Like this project doesn't actually have slabs or columns. There are no types. This is a single part that continuously repeats and has no function before it's assembled to the building. The parts are independent of the whole. They could also be assembled into multiple other buildings. And the building in itself is also kind of, you could say, continuously, incomplete or finished. You could kind of remove or add something here. I would also argue that phenomenologically speaking, that this achieves a continuous spatial quality. This is a single material operation that defines everything around you. So it's not it's a project that is ultimately kind of serves in a way a kind of experience of continuity. I would argue that it's a smooth project and an organic project, although it only consists of 90-degree angles. Also what is interesting is to just kind of emphasize that, yeah, that these parts are there, that their function only kind of emerges after your assembly. I'll skip a little bit because I'm noticing I'm already running out of time with all of the things that I want to mention. So then, you know, I got an opportunity to actually build a section of this project at the Royal Academy in London. So that was fantastic. Like we could just kind of isolate a part of this project, and I would have the chance to just, you know, sit in it. It's kind of a fantastic opportunity as an architect that you could build a one-to-one, you know, section of what you've been playing around with. So this consists all of this kind of lightweight L-shaped and straight elements cut out of timber sheets that are then assembled and establish this kind of spatial condition that is derived from that previous project. And as you see here, weight, mass, and volume are completely disconnected. The parts look huge, but they're actually very light. Now we're actually at a very exciting stage where we're building this one. This is actually on site right now. It's a very, you know, probably the most boring project you can do as an architect, and that you always have to do as a young architect. It's a house extension in Ghent, like a very simple kind of, you know, very simple house extension with a tiny, tiny budget, but very exciting. We're finally being able to kind of prove, you know, bring all of this kind of research together and build this thing. So this should be up sometime in November. We're digging the foundation right now. And then it's also interesting to kind of just briefly speculate on, like, you know, how this kind of things work aesthetically, or what makes them work. I mean, the most logical project in a way for the discrete, maybe you could argue, is the one on the left. That's also the most uninteresting one. That would be stacking discrete parts so that they, you know, form an arch or a dome, and you would be a victim. I mean, you would just be doing the most primitive kind of thing, which is like trying to grapple with gravity. And I think that's a kind of, you know, for me at least, a very boring and uninteresting project. Then another logical project for the discrete would be the pile. There's a lot of piles these days in architecture, especially in the US, lots of piles. I do like piles, but, you know, there's a lot of people doing piles, so I don't need to do piles. And piles would be kind of, you know, piles of discrete parts that are, you know, arranged also in a way with gravity, but kind of getting rid of the overarching form. And then, like, the strange thing is with the kind of discrete assemblies that I'm working with is that they are somehow in conversation with kind of ironically maybe with familiar aspects, right? So there is a kind of a deliberate privileging, for example, of the kind of the horizontal datum, which then makes these things kind of, on the one hand, readable, and on the other hand, kind of strangely familiar. Again, it's a kind of a provocation, like that's, you know, it's a meson domino, Le Corbusier's domino, that, and at the same time, it's not meson domino, right? Like the argument is that this looks like maybe on first sight superficially like meson domino, but actually it's radically different from the domino. And it's also radically different, not only kind of architecturally, but also in what it implies for the construction industry. So this is, you know, a consequence of modernism in a way, of extreme modernism, as Rem Koolhaas showed at the Venice Biennale, where he was showing kind of this terrible mess that we find ourselves in, that is called like the contemporary building industry. So he kind of just, you know, made his encyclopedia of the horror show that we have to operate in, this kind of incredibly wasteful and complicated, commodified building industry, where ultimately the architect is reduced to a kind of, you know, mere kind of dressing up, where a decorator, where architecture from where it was previously maybe a spatial profession, now it's just a profession of cladding, where we're stuck to this kind of, you know, millimeters thin surface that then communicates kind of our intent. So in a way, the discrete ambitiously and naively tries to just get entirely rid of that world, right? The idea is that we will not deal with this stuff that Rem was showing at the Biennale. We will just use the digital, and maybe that's the most powerful aspect of the digital. We'll think about digital fabrication not to make kind of, you know, complex super forms, but to just completely eradicate the existing building industry, and to have really the idea that you could just with a machine produce, with a single machine kind of produce an entire building. So this is my version of, Rem Koolhaas Elements of Architecture book. It would be a very thin book. It would just be called Elements of Architecture, and it would have one part in the book, right? I should Photoshop this better, that it actually looks like a kind of millimeter thin volume. And so I'm kind of obsessed with this battle with the Maison Domino. Like I would argue in the way that, that we have never really managed to get rid of modernism. Like despite what the early digital was trying to do, this kind of ghost of the domino is still persistent and present today, underlying kind of, or supporting in a way our kind of architectural visions. So within this kind of world that Rem Koolhaas was showing, where you kind of as an architect operate in a millimeter thin profession, where you're just cladding out essentially Maison Domino frames with, some kind of form of meaning. This would be my kind of very blunt diagram that illustrates architectural history since 1915, like, 1 century of architectural experimentation. So we start with the domino, the postmodern attempt to diffuse the domino, then Peter Eisenman's attempt to, twist 2 dominoes together to get rid of the relationship between, to disconnect form and function. And then, the kind of parametricist early digital project, where we kind of clad the domino with, CNC cut plasterboard panels to make it look continuous. And then the kind of, project that was very popular in the US in the past few years, the kind of O project, where we want to articulate kind of the autonomy of the building as kind of an object, but then, we make it look like an object with the exterior cladding, but then if you look inside, it's just a stack of dominoes, right? With a kind of atrium here and there. So I would then argue that this is the most radical thing that you can do today. Like none of this, since 1970, none of that is fundamentally new. It's all indebted to, they're postmodernisms in a way. They're kind of grappling with modernism, but they don't fundamentally, they cannot fundamentally get rid of it. And this one, although it is exactly, it looks vaguely familiar, but it is actually the only one that is fundamentally different, because nothing in that model on the right exists in the model on the left. And it implies a kind of a complete change in everything from authorship to the way that we produce to the way that we design. And I mean, of course, I'm deeply biased, because since working on the discrete since 5-6 years, my eyes cannot see traditional form or architecture anymore. I always see Villa Savoye in this stage, which is before it was restored. I cannot see kind of the plaster shapes. I know that it consists of just bricks that are painted white, that it's not even continuous concrete, right? I always see it at this stage. And the kind of, in a way, the projects of parts, like if you look at this is the wall of Osaka Castle in Japan. If you would model this in Rhino, you could define it's just an oblique wall, right? There's no creativity in there. It's a stupid oblique wall. Yet it's like fantastically beautiful, right? And this beauty has nothing to do with kind of super form or anything. It just has to do with kind of the presence and the autonomy of these parts. Of course, they're well crafted, and I'm not making an argument for craft here or for kind of Swiss detailing, but I'm making an argument for, kind of the parts of itself, right? So with my kind of eyes that cannot unsee anymore, like this is from my Instagram feed. These are some images from some brilliant architects today working in the US, but all, older buildings are timber frames, right? And afterwards, when they're clad with plasterboard and titanium, they're going to look very different. But fundamentally, I cannot unsee that they're actually the same building. So I cannot do this project anymore. I'm completely messed up there. I cannot do this project, which is a project about space, right? Like this could be, a timber framed building as well. It's Toyo Ito's brilliant U house, right? Like this is the building that you sketch on a napkin as an architect, where you go to the site, you talk to the client, you make a napkin sketch, and you're like, you come up with an idea, right? Which is like, oh, I'm going to make a patio, and then I'm going to curve, the living room around it. And you're working with space, that's what you learn in architecture school. I cannot do that anymore. I can't work with this kind of things. I can do this project though, which is Sue Fujimoto, House H. That one you can do with a stack of parts, like that's fine. Or you can be, if you want to be, if you're really into grids, you can do this one. Totally fine with discrete parts, right? You can do a grid that is not a grid. And again, I'm probably going to skip this, but I mean, in a way, you can also repeat yourself, which I think is great. Like you can be extremely lazy in your kind of seriality, right? So to kind of maybe, because I'm seeing I'm nearing my 30 minutes, I'm not even like halfway through my lecture as usual, but like this is maybe a nice slide to kind of, wrap up this kind of premise of the dialectic, right? So we could kind of argue that the discrete is not dialectically related to continuity nor to modernism. So it's not the opposite of continuity. And it's not the opposite of modernism. So it takes on board the assembly, the seriality of modernism, but it rejects the universality of modernism. And it takes on board the kind of the ability of the continuous to treat every instance as unique and to dismiss kind of the fixity of typology and form function relationships. So whereas the continuous was dialectically related to the modern, the discrete is not dialectically related to either. So it's not opposed. It's something that is, I would argue fundamentally new. And then these are just my versions of Greg Lynn's curve, right? Changing, it's also agnostic to scale. So you could do a discrete project depending, you could do it on different scales. And while these things get intrinsically more and more boring, like this is also a discrete project, they have nothing in common with any building that we know today. And Ebrahim, can I please show my second part of the lecture? I'm going to be nice and I'm going to skip like this part, but if I get 5 more minutes, I can.
Oh, sure. I mean, I was going to say, please take your time. I can, even if you have to, I can shorten my part a little bit more. I think are really excited to.
Very generous, but I'll keep it like really short. But I mean, essentially like, the kind of, I just want to kind of wrap up to make a kind of a point that, which is an important point for the discussion afterwards as well, that, what are the kind of, so the discrete has, I think, an interest purely in architectural terms in itself as kind of a disciplinary project of kind of, toying around and researching kind of the bits and pieces that architecture does. So in itself, I think that's one thing, but I mean, the important thing is of what we can do with it, right? And I think that is kind of the question of like how it relates in the world and how it could become something that accesses these kind of larger questions that have social and political consequences. So obviously the discrete is, I think, a project that is, very well suited for housing. And that's kind of, when I built a pavilion in Tallinn as a kind of a, slightly pretentious proposition that this would be a domino, it of course wanted to talk about the fact that it could become housing, mass housing, that we could again do this as architects. And then with my students at the Bartlett, we're of course, actively working on doing all of these projects with robots, having robots assemble these discrete parts, or in some instances, having the discrete parts assemble themselves, and experimenting on housing. And ultimately where this is leading to now is to kind of also a kind of radical questioning of also the kind of interfaces, and like that's also why I want to drop this here, or the kind of platforms that would help us create housing. So we're working basically on trying to establish kind of alternative platforms to increase access to housing that capitalize on automation. And that has actually emerged, I think this is the kind of the question that relates to 2020, because, in 2008, when I graduated, there was no Facebook, Instagram, the word platform economy did not exist. What has radically changed in the 12 years since the crisis is platform capitalism, is the kind of, the way how big tech has begun to kind of reconfigure our world, and also is beginning to reconfigure our built environment. So this is kind of a call to arms as architects that we need to kind of, that we need to begin to think about how other actors are changing our construction industry, and that we, with the kind of the proposition of discrete automation, that we could ultimately establish a kind of a more democratic, but also more inspiring form of automation. And if we don't do that, it's this kind of big actors like Katera and Google Sidewalk Labs who will be, kind of giving us the parts that they want to design the world with, right? Which are not even dialectically related to modernism. Like this is purely 1950s prefab, right, with a platform attached to it. So this is kind of why ultimately, like this would be the house of the future if we don't take care as architects, completely kind of digitally designed, BIM managed, and brought to you with a digital platform, and you would be a subscriber there, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's not architecture anymore, it's not a house, it's a facility. So that's kind of why I have kind of doubled my practice. So the first part of the lecture 2008 was, as the work that is driving my own practice, and it's in a way deeply personal, like also operates under my own name. But then with a research lab at Bartlett, we have done a spin-off, which is called Automated Architecture, together with my colleagues Molly Claypool and Manuel Jimenez Garcia, where we have basically kind of taken the most boring discrete part that is possible, the box. And we have kind of started to begin with a bit of government grants and research grants to set up an alternative platform that ambitiously wants to compete on the building market to produce housing based on this, like the most uncreative ever kind of, like, I think this is deeply ironic and fantastically kind of funny that, that company is a tech company and it's based on a box. So what we're doing, this is our own office that we built with those boxes. These boxes are obviously fully automated. They can be assembled by robots. We're working on all the kind of software and interfaces to help other people to program robots that could assemble these boxes, to algorithms that can automatically assemble these boxes and send instructions to larger groups of people to do this. And we're just back from site in Bristol, where we worked with a local community of people who are part of a program that is trying to give them access to housing. So we're working on a kind of pilot scheme with a local organization, Lowell West Media Center, where we're basically creating, kind of involving these people in our building system. So they are designing, we give them a software to design with our boxes, with our discrete elements. And then ultimately they also build their own structure. And this is kind of, ultimately the kind of premise beyond this kind of interesting architectural debates, the kind of the premise of what discreteness could do, that it could kind of enable in a way communities to get access to automation and therefore bypass this kind of massive platform economies that are trying to occupy this space. These are some images fresh from the photographer showing kind of, it's a prototype, but in the next, we're working on a series of houses with that community that will be based on the system and designed by that community. So this is even a factory we're designing in Bristol that would be building those houses. So the factory is built of the parts, and then the factory kind of produces more of those parts, and then ultimately produces housing as well. And yeah, I'll keep it there, but that's kind of, I think, important to make this because it also talks about authorship and about modes of practice between automated architecture and my own practice. And I think they are in this, it's not that I will keep doing both, because they also produce, I think, an interesting false dialectic between the two. So only 8 minutes over time, Ebrahim, sorry. For my standards, that's a good one.
No, for everyone's standard, I think. That was awesome. So thank you so much, Gilles. That was fantastic. And I think you're kind of making it hard to follow, in terms of like presenting after you. So, and good luck for me on that. So I think, can I share this screen? Let me see. So let me try. So can you see my screen, everyone? Perfect. So again, thank you so much, Gilles. That was awesome. And I love where you kind of ended the conversation. That's pretty much where I start in the, more or less the conversation about platforms. But instead, I'm probably going to go a little bit backward in a sense. So I think the conversation for tonight was the main key for me, or the main driver to develop this short presentation with respect to the time that we had, which kind of reminded me I should have started the timer. And really, because we feel, and you already have, Gilles, pointed out some binaries or dialectic points, which are conversation makers or kind of discourse producers. I wanted to focus a little bit on those and specifically talk about platforms in that relation. So I start quickly with just a quick demo of where the work comes from, or like a quick summarized version of some of the work I've done, or some of the work that has been produced in my studios or research clusters, which are mainly looking into technology as a creative discourse, as a creative medium, and then trying to kind of push the boundaries or trying to ask questions regarding the design process itself. So that's the part that I mentioned. I think I'm going backward in that sense. So the conversation I would have tonight, or the presentation I would have tonight, is mainly focused on pre-design aspects of automation or autonomy before the artifact kind of occurs, in a sense, or the outcome happens. In a sense, I think it would be a dialogue between UI and UX, even though I think your work also serves as UI to an extent. But that would really be the main theme of the conversation for tonight. And I try to, again, for the sake of the conversation, try to position kind of the, the project that I'm doing as a way to kind of augment our conversation afterwards from probably like a different perspective type of conversation. So I will let this video to end. And by the way, can you hear the audio or no? Okay, so I will probably reshare after this my screen, or okay. So for the sake of the rest of the presentation, let me just stop this for a second and reshare, just so I can make sure we have the audio. Okay, now I think, I mean, it doesn't have audio, but I think we should have. Okay, so to start with, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the basically false binaries, or some of the binaries that are there, just to point them out. I think we are kind of looking at them more often than let me see what's going on. So do you see the screen? I feel that it is not being shared, but if it is, can
we can see.
Okay, so I don't see anyone, which is kind of awkward. Yeah. Anyways, I'll keep going. But yeah, so as I said, the conversation for me on the presentation side is really going to be about the binaries, and some of them that are kind of falser than the others, and in some sort of appreciative way. So I would start with the first one, just to point it out, that I would consider myself a formalist, and probably that's one of the few labels I would take proudly. And I think that's really visible through the work that you'll see, or the work that is kind of published from me, in multiple kind of platforms, or through multiple different agendas. So from the speculative work to the drawings, to products, to the teaching sides, I think they all show the interest for kind of like a formal interest, or the formal perspective that is being projected on what we do. And similarly, that continues to happen throughout the work that I do and with my students at Robotically Augmented Design Lab, ranging from controllers to products to objects to interfaces, platforms, gesticulations, and so on and so forth. So I think that just is an attempt to try to more or less situate or visualize the work that we do in terms of where it belongs to. And I don't mean formalism necessarily in contrast with functionalism, I really mean it as a fundamental kind of a vision, which is kind of ties back into Russian formalism in that sense. So now let's talk a little bit more specifically about the conversation for tonight and where it connects to what we've been discussing with Jill and some of the conversation about platform. So I think that the first thing that helps to situate the work is knowing that this statement basically that I'm, as a designer and researcher, interested in digitalizing the physical and physicalizing the digital, which I think in a sense, from a very different perspective or based on a very different interest, kind of ties back to this great conversation as well as the post-digital. The other kind of like statement that is rooted in binaries is that I think I would look at architecture as a medium for experience itself. So in another word, I would say, I would argue that architecture itself as an even built environment is more than an inhabition, and it is really a platform to experience truth. And then if we go forward with that, I would argue that architecture also is able or capable to be considered as an extended software or interface. So not only to become a platform to be experienced, but also as an interface that senses back in a sense that it becomes like an extension of software or extension of the design environment in a way, the post-screen conversation that I mentioned. The other aspect, I think within the project that I mentioned, I would use tangible technologies as intellectual vehicles for this proposed post-digitality, in a way to extend that architectural capabilities as a medium and to kind of augment that experiential aspects of the built environment. I would suggest and I would argue that tangible interfaces or tangible technologies are possible platforms or possible vehicles for that post-digitality. And then as an alternative, I think this can tie back theoretically to an alternative reading of digitality and physicality and human-machine interaction with some degrees of autonomy, which I think is one of the topics that we're gonna talk about, the difference between degrees of automation and degrees of autonomy and so on and so forth, and the dialogue or the difference that these have. So I think, again, it is kind of weird that I don't see anyone, but it might have been kind of like too many statements all kind of like back to back. So let's look at them all again, just so we can situate the work that I'm going to present after in a more kind of a clear way, in a sense that it comes from a specific view. So as I said, I'm a formalist, so please consider that. I'm interested in digitalizing and physicalizing, which is in a way saying that I'm interested in hybridization, and I'm kind of tired, or I have a statement about the ubiquity of digital. So there is a way that I propose, which is physicalizing and digitalizing, as a way to argue with that. And I would like to use architecture and built environment as extended software interface, which is the UI aspect, user interface, and also as a medium for experiencing. So it becomes both a UI and UX kind of platform. And I am proposing to use, and again, it's not only me, obviously. So the work that I feel the project with capital P that I feel my project belongs to is really talking about this. And I'm interested in using tangible technologies as vehicles to challenge the ubiquity of digital through an alternative reading of post-digitality through human-machine interaction, human-computer interaction, and some degrees of autonomy. So with that, I hope that it kind of puts the work in a context that now we can look at it with a critical lens that where it comes from and what it tries to argue. So for tonight's conversation, or for tonight's presentation, the short presentation, I would start with the core of my work, which is design, and then the intersection of it with interface and experience as UI and UX. This is more or less where the work belongs, or where the work exists. And it's kind of leaking sometimes into the experience side more, sometimes into the interface side. But for today's conversation, my beloved false binaries, it's gonna exist more or less where the interface and the design kind of intersect. So it is really a conversation around interface and platform, but kind of a little bit beyond just digital or screen-based interfaces, and how we can take it out of the computer, how we can talk about architecture as an interface. So firstly, I would start with the ones that are kind of closer to the interface conversation directly. So one of the early projects that we have done that is a little bit more directly connected to this conversation is called No Keyboard, No Mouse project, which actually has been done. And I had the credits up here, but it's not here for some reason, with my students at University of Kentucky, where we really looked into authorship and the relationship of authorship, design environment, and the design process through platforms. So basically, the conversation is how we can produce an interface that has already embedded logics in it. So it kind of brings in some levels of autonomy through a master designer, what we call. And then those hardware platforms serve as interface for design mediums or design platforms, in this case, Rhino. So throughout the semester, or throughout this project, basically, students developed a custom-made physical interface hardware as extension of the software that can be embedded into any other platforms or any other interfaces and serve as an intermediate component to kind of, in a way, change or extend the software relationship with the physical environment in a sense that it becomes extended into the physical, tangible, experiential medium. So at this level, I think for No Keyboard, No Mouse, it is still very much an interface project, and I wouldn't argue it has become spatial, but in a sense, from the design perspective, this could and can and will question the possibilities of authorship or multi-author project, where you pass knowledge through an encoded device, in a sense. So where you can, again, bring some level of, or some degrees of autonomy and I wouldn't say automation, some degrees of autonomy by embedding design strategies. Again, maybe similar to an extent, similar to the app that Gilles showed at the end of the presentation with the R work, very kind of like has its own guidelines. It is borrowing ideas and logics from the gaming structures as a way to question the design platform and the possibilities of validifying or kind of validating the outcome of the design through the lens of kind of augmentation of the design process through multi-user, multi-designer kind of agenda. So I would let this one to go a little bit further, or maybe I jump a little bit for the sake of time. Again, the same scenario, there's the similar, just a similar interface. Again, the question for this project was mainly about the interface and UI within the architectural digital design platforms. So it doesn't necessarily suggest anything in terms of the extension of the design outcome from the experiential perspective, but it really questions how we interact with the software and how it can become more accessible or more democrat, in a sense, that is becoming accessible to more than just the professional designer or the like a trained designer. The second project, or the second group of projects, is really initiated with the same question, but this time trying to use native translators between the physical and digital. So I would argue robot arms, or robots just in general, and mixed realities, AR, XR, or similar platforms are kind of native translators. So it kind of initiated for me from the A+D project, or A+D group show, in 2018, curated by Tony Murray, Yvonne Bernal, and Ryan Martinez, which was kind of a projection-based question that we had to kind of narrate 3 stories in a section, plan, and elevation. And the way that I try to interact. This project was, again, narrating a story or trying to question the scale and the story and depth through an actor of a robotic arm, where it becomes kind of an interface again, this time to narrate a story in a more spatial way, where it starts to bring a little bit of a depth. This project, which was a really short kind of experiential project, led into which I have a little bit of a more kind of visible version of it here, initiated a bigger question of how we can really question the role of the technology, or the role of the robotic technology, as well as the XR media's, again, virtual reality, augmented reality, or mixed reality, as a way to augment the physical space. That led, which is kind of a result of the previous project, that led into a project that we have done in my research cluster at Kent, at Rad Lab, where we looked at this in a little bit more integrated way, where the robotic platform and the augmented reality work together as a way to extend, literally extend, the software outside of the physical environment, outside of the digital environment, and as a way to hybridize the physicality of the space through the experience. It is basically a kind of a straightforward process to bring in the augmented reality into the game through Unity, the game engine platform. And we had a kind of curated setup where the robot arm was synchronized basically with the digital environment, where it has it had basically the augmented reality material, and it was able to kind of interact with it. So using the initial studies, we produced something like this, where again the audience, through the lens of the AR application, could experience the setup not only in a physical way, meaning the sound of the robot, the physical interactivity of it, the touch quality, so on and so forth, but also to augment that experience in a parallel augmented reality way. So in a sense, this architectural setup, or this spatial setup as a built setup, became more and more digitalized, in a sense, if you will. So the footage that we are looking at is through the AR kind of application, and the robot is the real. So it's basically the dialogue between the robotic arm directly with the digital content and digital environment, as a way to kind of question that possibility of hybridizing the physical environment through an interface. So in another word, if you compare it to the No Keyboard No Mouse project, it starts to kind of emerge out from the screen or digital environment, and not only produce an interface for interaction, but also a setup for experiencing the digitality of physical. In another word, bringing some digital qualities outside of the computer, as a way to kind of hybridize that spatial experience. Again, if we go back all the way to the first couple of slides that I showed, if we consider architecture as a UI and UX medium, then again, these technological tools become vehicles for narrating that conversation in a more diversified and hybridized way. And again, this was done in collaboration with two of my students at Kent. And then we used, just as a side comment, and I'm gonna skip this mainly, we used, or I used the same mechanism to produce a fabrication-based scenario too. So it's technically a physical robot that kind of virtually fabricates the piece before we test it out. So it kind of shows all the flaws and possible joint limitations or physical limitations that are not reproducing the perfection of the software. So in a way, again, in just a different application of the same interface. And these are not in order year-wise, but just order for the sake of the presentation. And I think Robable, another project, is kind of pushing that a little bit further, in a way that it brings digitality outside of the computer, but this time through literal motion, what Reagan would say, compared to phenomenal motions, or the visualized motions of organization of pieces, or just like overlaying the digital. So it was a custom-made robotic installation, this time from inside out, but it could have simply be the other way around, from outside in, where basically you could control the articulation of the, in this case, surface, or articulation of the object that is being produced. As I said, it could have been a wall, through a custom-made cell phone app. So in another word, it was trying, and it is trying, to bring out the digital qualities of animated components, or digital qualities of reconfiguration through the use of a custom-made robotic installation as a way to serve as an interface, but not only as an interface, but as a kind of augmentation of the experience. In a way that it becomes more and more kind of, again, I'm kind of a little bit trying to be cautious about the use of word autonomy or automated, because I don't think it's neither, but really through those kind of agendas, if you will. So it becomes already something that has some sort of agency, and then it cohabits in a way as a thing, basically, beyond an object. And these are just digital renderings and some detail shots of the thing. And again, as I said, this is just a surface project, so it can really be applied to any other inside out scenarios. Just a quick follow-up on that, which I don't think, or maybe I should just actually, I passed this. It was just very similar thing. This time the robot was kind of responding to music, or responding to voice, which again was not necessarily the main project to show. So I just pass it. But again, that the communication can really happen through multiple different platforms or mediums. And then lately, or maybe lastly, I should say, I just bring that question a little bit further, or ask that question a little bit further up, about the autonomy of parts, or the question of how parts can start kind of having characteristics, and how can they become capable of reconfiguration. So the heteroanimogeneous project was again a grad studio I taught at Kent. We used a custom-made, again, super straightforward workflow plugin that enables, or enabled, and it can still enable students to animate kind of architectural robotic operations through keyframing in Rhino. And then we kind of use that as a way to kind of question the reconfigurability of parts and pieces. Sorry. Okay. Parts and pieces through more or less a conversation of super components. So it was really looking at the desktop scale, at the question of whether architecture, and again, looking at architecture as a composition. So looking at architecture as a composition, it was asking the question of how basically the presence of the language of part-to-part relationship and part-to-all relationship can augment the possibilities of reconfiguration, the possibilities of readjusting position, and kind of producing different scenarios. Obviously, it is at the desktop scale, but I think that the question was really about kind of again using architecture itself, or the proposal for building itself, this time as an interface for again the design process, and as a way to kind of rethink the possibilities of parts and question the. Okay. I think this should help, because for some reason it was not showing me the video. Anyway, so we can go to the next one actually for the sake of time too. The same scenario, again, the question of super components and part-to-part relationship and part-to-whole relationship as a way to produce an architectural formal agenda in a sense that how they can reconfigure themselves or how it can produce some sort of part autonomy in a sense that in a sense of a kind of using the operational setup as an interface for design. So not only as a experience producer later when it comes or it goes to the scale, which again is a totally different question, but at this scale, at the desktop scale, using it as a way to reproduce multiple times the design of the component, the design of the composition and the object, and how these parts come together based on the operation of the motion. So in another word, I would argue it is really a study of a solid void through part-to-whole relationship, where the robot is kind of becoming a void maker as it kind of moves the parts apart from each other, kind of in a physical manner. So it really uses that interface quality as like a physical interface for extension of its own.
Yeah, Ebrahim, not to interrupt, but I did want to tell you, so we have time for discussion. Wrap up. Thanks.
Oh, sure. So yeah, and I think that's pretty much, I barely heard Brendan, but I think that's pretty much it. And I would just jump in. I wouldn't show these guys. And again, just to be able to put it in the context and kind of like move to the conversation after this. Again, just a reminder, this was all presented by a formalist who is interested in digitalizing the physical and physicalizing the digital, using architecture and built environment as an extended of software interface and as a medium for experience, and uses tangible technologies as a vehicle to challenge the ubiquity of digital through alternative readings of post-digitality and using human-machine interaction and human-computer interaction and some degrees of autonomy. Okay. Thank you so much, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you both so much for the fantastic lectures and presentations. So we're gonna switch over to the discussion part. So I'll let you guys kind of take it over. But I just wanted to kind of add again into the discussion. For anyone who wants to ask questions, shoot me an instant message or a private message on the chat in Zoom or on YouTube, and I will relay it to these guys. But I'm gonna let you guys chat it out now. But fantastic presentations. Thank you guys.
Okay, awesome. So again, I should start with again thanking you, Gilles, for first being here and for the fantastic presentation. And as was expected, you made it hard for me to kind of follow on your presentation. So I think, I mean, even though now it kind of landed onto the platform conversation again, I would like to go back and start from where you started the conversation through the kind of pointing out the aesthetics and the design agenda that kind of led you to this. Because I mean, we kind of touched base on it in our chats, but I think it is really interesting that, I mean, you have a really robust theoretical framework and technological framework for what you do. But interestingly enough, there is a baggage or there's a legacy that comes with your projects, even from post or pre-discrete eras in your work, right? So from the block projects that are mainly like agent-based, or when it comes to the chair projects at Bartlett, so on and so forth, I think there is always this very interesting like formal and aesthetical interest for blockhood, for roughness, for again what later became in a sense the aesthetics of your discrete project. So I was wondering if you can touch base on that, and just let's begin our very first false binary in a sense that was it a formal decision or the aesthetical decision for you, or it was really a kind of like a suggestion by the theoretical framework that you were interested in, or it's like a critical move or a critical position towards digital. So
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I mean, I'm kind of looking at trying to understand this better myself, because I mean, my work has a kind of a moment before it became really radically discrete that is actually not, purely discrete. Like the projects I was showing or the Guggenheim Helsinki Museum and the Budapest Museum, which are this kind of like, spaghettis or stick projects, right? And of course, there are some tropes in those projects that come back also in my own work on discreteness. I mean, I would say though that that's probably something that carries through, and that is maybe defined with my position versus other people in this discrete discourse, is the fact that also the kind of pre-discrete projects thrive on this kind of confrontation between something that is quite boring and quite familiar, like the kind of the slab was already there, or the kind of the strata was there, and then the confrontation of dissolving that with tons and tons of bits and pieces and parts. And of course, in the beginning, it was a bit more like unconstrained and was more maybe messy and a bit more forgiving and less kind of pedantically discrete, right? And then, ultimately, then it moved towards a kind of a much more kind of hardcore understanding of discreteness. But you could also say that you could say that that's kind of like an aesthetic bias that is maybe interested in this kind of interrogation with maybe kind of simple primitive base forms, etc., etc., and that kind of carries through. But on the other hand, you could also kind of say that maybe it's more a critical question, and that actually the underlying question of both the discrete work and the previous work is actually kind of trying to figure out some fundamental rules about architecture and how they work. Like all of them are kind of interrogating maybe architectural assumptions, right? So the fact that that the slab is there is a kind of, in a way, it's a critical question, right? It's kind of saying like like it's asking by basically like the Budapest project, by taking just 3 slabs, it's also kind of as asking a critical question of like how trying to understand what like space is, right? Like do you really need to kind of like like can we do a project that does not rely on kind of massive large scale spatial moves to achieve space? So in one way or another, you could say that independent of like the discrete, that there is always kind of that it's in a way kind of trying to figure out how things work. And in that sense, you could say in your language, Ebrahim, you would say that it's maybe the discrete is a medium to interrogate architecture, right? You're using the discrete block as a bit that you use to sample, and I'm sampling architecture, like kind of quite kind of, I have a project that is a pure box, for example. I have a project that is a pure slab. I have one that is a pitched roof, maybe originally. And I use those things to kind of, the discrete part in a way is a medium to reread those things, and it kind of become a critical method of investigation.
No, that's great. I totally agree. And I think that, I mean, you pointed out very interestingly, I have a couple of notes from your presentation today about, a couple of touch bases that you made today about the qualities of your work, which is a different language so you're covering it with the umbrella of discreteness, but you also pointed out minimal digital, right? So it is in a sense bringing some others, sensory base or, kind of attentions into the game, which is really formal and which is really aesthetical, right? So you were talking about minimalism. You were talking about something that actually I was going to ask you today, resolution, right? So I think it is really interesting, or I'm excited to ask you that where it becomes your discrete, because conceptually speaking, and I think it's a formal kind of aesthetical question, but conceptually speaking, anything that comes out of, like anything that exists in a sense is, unless it is mathematical or philosophical, it is discrete to an extent, right? So even the digit-based scenarios that we see digitally are, in a conceptual way, made out of digits. So they're to a degree, discrete. Or even the Surface projects, or the Surface project from early 90s, it is really a discrete project in the sense that it has to be sliced into a CNC machine. So it becomes a kind of group of lines and components. So I think one question, and I know part of the answer because we discussed about this, but part of my question is where it starts to become your discrete. like in terms of like that frame that you're cropping this out, and
I mean, like first of all, it's important to kind of distinguish between, like to be precise about the term discrete, right? And you're right to say that, discrete, if you disconnect it from, the kind of meaning that we assign to it in the lecture, because I mean, we obviously didn't invent that word. And, as all architectural tendencies or movements, the kind of name is absolutely like badly chosen, that it does not describe the content at all, which is like what always happens, right? But that's good because then it generates discussions. But anyway, like, okay, like, discreteness is a property, and obviously like, the coffee cup you're drinking from now is discrete from the world. It's autonomous. It's a separate coffee cup, and we can go completely triple O in this kind of questions that are deeply philosophical, like there's Mariology, which is like the philosophy of part-to-whole relationships, where you then have positions like mereological nihilism, which are people who are saying that essentially the world does not have proper parts, and like there's enormous, a deep kind of rabbit hole you can disappear into, like philosophically discussing parts, Mariology, right? And it's also all like scale related, etc., etc. But I mean, the way that we're using the term discrete, it's important to understand that we're using it as digital discrete, right? We're always saying the word discrete, but actually it should be digital discrete. So architecture obviously has always been in conversation with discreteness and with continuity. We've always worked with parts in architecture, but we've never understood those parts in a digital way. So I would argue that, for example, the kind of early 90s surface project, for example, that you're describing, when we're slicing that project, of course, academically speaking, it's called discretizing because you cut it into parts. But architecturally speaking, I would argue that these are not actually parts. Like a better word would be components, right? They're sub-parts that are derived from the whole and that are not autonomous. So in our kind of understanding of discreteness, it's very important that the part needs to be autonomous from the whole. It cannot be derived from the whole. It precedes the whole, right? Which is the difference between, a Lego kit. A Lego kit does not know about the whole, right? Except this kind of super commercial, like Star Wars Legos that were developed like recently, which are like, horrible, right? Do not give that to your children. But like, so because those have an understanding of a whole, right? They want to be like a spaceship. And like, that's the difference with like, a Lego, and if you would buy, for example, a model kit to make like an airplane, for example, right? You can only make that airplane with a model kit. Or you can do some kit bashing, but I mean, whatever. But like, you can only technically make that airplane. So those parts are not parts, they're components that are derive their entire existence from the whole, right? And they want to be kind of unified into the whole. So I think when we're talking about discreteness, we mean like discreteness proper in its most kind of radical and fundamental meaning, right?
No, I think that's great. I mean, I partially asked that to bring up some of the topics that we discussed, and I thought they were super fun and interesting to point them out. So I'm just like provoking, some of those, just so if you feel elaborating on them. We were talking about, the formation versus, the kind of like presence of the unit, detached from the system, or the existence of it independent, as you mentioned. And I think something that might be interesting to point out one more time to me, and I think maybe just new to everyone, is the one more time kind of elaborating the difference of your discreteness and the way that, for example, someone like Conviscom approaches the discreteness, from like broken into parts versus made out of parts, right?
Yeah, like that's an interesting one, right? I mean, because obviously, like, so like, and it goes back to that idea, right? That the part needs to be preceding the whole, right? So and then I mean, of course, it takes you again down like a really long discussion, because of course, like for example, in Tom Wiscombe's work, there are kind of these like mega parts, right? That are huge in themselves, consisting of component parts, right? And I mean, I guess that's a little bit, why Tom, for example, references model kits, and maybe I reference Lego, right? It's like that's a bit the difference, that in a way, ultimately, it's a discrete kind of whole, maybe, but in itself, it's kind of, it consists of subparts and components, right? So in a way, it's like kind of, you can only use those things to create that kind of instance. And of course, I mean, maybe at some point you can recycle it into another project, and that then starts another discussion of like of discreteness, right? But that's also like it also corresponds, when I was showing like the timber framing Instagram post, right? Like for me, that is kind of, some of those timber framing Instagram, things that you see. I mean, at some point, one of them will become a cylinder or like a funky kind of, autonomous object. But like, I would not understand any of those things as discrete, right? Because they can never be. It's literally like you're making kind of a larger object from all of these subcomponents. You're pouring in all that labor until it kind of visually appears as an autonomous discrete object, which is an enormous difference with the way that we think about discreteness, which has this kind of economic and political consequences of that. These parts can be assembled by other authors. They could be distributed. They could be traded. They're in relationship with other ways of establishing production chains, etc., etc., etc. So it's a very kind of different project. And I mean, one we could say is maybe more of a formalist project, Ebrahim. And the other one I would argue is I mean, I'm also not shy. I mean, I'm super interested in form, obviously, right? Like no, I mean, I don't even understand very well always like what. I mean, I liked how you said that, like formalism in a more Russian way. I like that as a kind of
form as a kind of medium for existence, right? So it's not there unless it has a form. No, I think the conversation you're bringing up, I think for two purposes, and we discussed this, but it is extremely crucial and critical. I think because you're questioning, even when we're talking about the discrete, you're questioning two really important things. One obviously is the social political aspects that you touched on it, in terms of questioning the custom made, mega objects, right? As a first kind of reaction to having the digital tools. Now we can now we can customize everything, which was the first question. I think you're challenging or questioning that in a sense. And I know you don't agree, but I would argue that you're in a sense post-digital if we accept digital has been there. Well, I know you say that it was never been there, which I tend to agree actually. But also the second is about two things. One is about the design part of it, right? So and the agency of the author, right? So is it the block that has been designed by the designer, or is it the composition that is resulted? And then does it have to be, and we kind of quickly or maybe shortly talked about this, but does it have to be kind of pointy, bulky, blocky, or it can be really up to the user or the second designer, if I would say, to kind of compose them in a more kind of blobby way even. Because again, it's really a matter of the scale, right? So
yeah, I mean the questions of authorship, I think, are extremely intriguing with discreteness, right? Because obviously, I mean, like there are a few things that are like, that are, like I would say like problematic or provocative, right? I mean, so the first one is obviously that, the question is like when I show that kind of work, maybe part one of the lecture, you could question, well, now does every architect need to design their own kit of parts and then like design a building? I mean, that's obviously not the kind of purpose, right? But at the same time, the work that I'm showing, is not there at this stage to be multiplied by other authors. Like I'm I think it's a deeply personal endeavor and a personal project. Like the parts, that are behind me in this building, they are like kind of part, like my practice thrives on those parts. They are like in the same, they're my kind of my kind of existence is based on those things, right? I use them in all my projects. They have a lot of engineering in them. The aesthetic is kind of tied to those things as well. So they're not actually there to be, multiplied or replicated by other people, which would then imply a kind of a position on authorship that every architect needs to invent their own material system. Like everyone needs to reinvent the water in that kind of scenario. So this is an impossible scenario to defend. like that is how, you know, you debunk the first part of my lecture, which is luckily then, you know, why automated architecture, so my kind of spin-off, does it actually in the proper way. Like that is just, you know, it's a part that is technically has no authorship. It's a box.
Exactly.
I mean, no one can claim the box, right? So, you know, you can do, and then with automated architecture, like, okay, so there is a kind of a totally non-creative kind of purely utilitarian almost base part that is a kind of an absolute primitive. And then other people can, you know, there is no authorship in that. The only authorship emerges in between the relationships that you establish in between the parts.
Exactly.
So if I take these boxes like that we're developing with automated architecture, and I could use them in my practice, and I've shown like a few assemblies in the first part of my lecture that are based on this kind of really large scale kind of massive boxes that are kind of stacked in together, and then painted in some in black and some are left in timber, and like that does become, I think, my authored project, right?
Yes.
And that is because I define a certain set of relationships that, you know, are maybe unique to like how I would do that. At the same time, someone else could take those and assemble them in a pure grid, or they could make a voxel cave with it, or they could, you know. So, and that is actually, I think, the real kind of power of discreteness, right? That you could actually establish a kind of a shared, you know, framework or platform, then you could say that the part becomes a platform. And then you could kind of graft multiple positions on authorship and multiple ideologies of part relations on top of that thing. And so that's also what we're trying, like, you know, in the second part of the lecture, when I'm showing this building that we designed for this community of people, like that is really like, I did not touch that thing, right? Like I have not designed anything there. Like that is literally a group of people who are not architects who have played around with the software, and then we've averaged out kind of, you know, all the designs together, and that became the design, right? And there's an enormously interesting conversation there also about like AI and about like how you would actually, you know, crowdsource these designs, and super interesting research agenda, and very different, right? And I mean, in a way, it's kind of, you know, for me, I don't think I could exist without these two parts. Like if I would just be doing the second part, I would feel like I'm too logistical. And you know, I like to do my kind of my own investigations, which are maybe a bit, you know, wilder and less tied to being completely completely pure, almost in the kind of ideology of discreteness, right? Like the second one also moves really almost into tech, right? It kind of abandons. So my own practice is kind of an old-fashioned, you could say, architectural practice that is concerned with the discipline, and that kind of asks this kind of like aesthetic questions and journeys, and that you know, that is in a way personal.
And I think Brandon had some questions. Go ahead.
I was gonna step in. I mean, I think that's super exciting, like talking about, I mean, hopefully we can come back to it maybe before the end of this idea of the kind of pipeline or the platforms that we're kind of looking at as architects, especially in a time when you know, we're kind of fluctuating between Amazon and maybe local markets. But before we get to that, I want to definitely open it up to some questions I've been getting through online. We've got some good ones. And this one comes from Andrew Pearson. And he's asking for both of you guys, so how does discrete architecture production become more accessible in a market where control of automation moves kind of majorly from top down, right? Kind of i.e. looking at the idea of Tesla's design of autonomous vehicles as they enter into like luxury products, right? So how do we kind of contribute to that as architects, or how do we kind of, I guess, maybe talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fantastic question, right? And that's, I mean, ultimately that is actually the question that is driving or like platform that we're trying to establish with automated architecture. That is really the question of like, how do we avoid automation being this kind of part of monopolistic platforms, right? Because ultimately, I mean, the tools that we need to automate are actually relatively affordable. You know, they're not actually that expensive. But it's like a problem of basically, creating, like giving communities access to these tools, right? So that's part of like what we want to try to do with automated architecture, is basically creating kind of toolkits that would allow, you know, larger groups of users to establish their own kind of automated production chains. And I think the digital has its, you know, like that's the kind of the optimistic story of the digital, right? Is that it produces so efficiently that it becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and everyone can become a producer, right? Like, I mean, before you could not, to be a movie maker, you needed an enormous amount of equipment and capital. Today, like every teenager is like a TikTok movie maker, right, with their phone. And you can do it almost at zero cost. And the same goes for like so many things that the digital has enabled. And among them, in principle, also production, right? You can start a factory with one machine. You can produce like incredible things just with a very small investment, whereas previously, in the 1950s, if you wanted to become a prefabricator, you needed millions of government investments to become a prefabricator. Today, you can set up a housing factory at a very low cost. Like we just did actually a costing for a housing factory that came in at 200,000 euros. You can start a factory for producing housing, right? Which is not, if you gather a few families together in principle, you could, it's not unrealistic. But of course, I mean, what Nick Cernicek and others have pointed out is that for example, if you think about, the Instagram photographers and the kind of TikTok video people, is that you need Instagram and TikTok for these technologies to thrive. They're the platforms, and the platforms is where the problem happens, right? Where the kind of, like the digital is democratic, but then at the same time, it distributes everything to the bottom, but at the same time, it establishes this kind of platforms that you can't overcome. And that is like obviously the kind of the big problem, what we're seeing now in the built environment with companies that are trying to become platforms, like Katera, obviously in the US market, very like intensively, and I mean, super interesting, right? Like Katera is a fascinating company, and they're disrupting an industry that needs to be disrupted. So I'm not saying that they're the evil guys here. And it's logical, they got a lot of venture capital, so they need to become a platform to pay back that venture capital. But it's a dangerous situation, right? And in one way or another, like we need to kind of, the rule with platforms is that the first one, that kind of succeeds to build a platform remains the platform, right? Which is the thing that happens with Uber. I mean, anyone can make an Uber app today. You can order one and make it somewhere else. It doesn't actually cost that much money. But the problem is you can never kind of compete now with Uber because they got there first and they have the network. So that's a bit, that's the kind of the big issue, right? When we're looking at housing, it's like, how can we, in a way, establish kind of platforms that are open enough and that can bypass the kind of pressure of these big prefabricators. And at the same time, also, you also need to take that like with a grain of salt. I mean, of course, like Katera is nowhere close to establishing a monopoly, right? The building industry is like a terrible, terrible industry. So like anything that those guys do, I think is fantastic that they're trying to push that. But we need to be, I think as architects, that's kind of one of the core questions I think that we should be debating. It's like, what would be the difference between a platform that actually has, like how would our platforms be different from their platforms, right? And one of those things I think is like, I would call it almost as you have biodiversity. I think like platforms that are, architectural platforms should have like part diversity, right? They should be able to create kind of whole ecologies of different relationships between parts, that it's not just the kind of the repeating kind of logistical project that like Katera is doing, which is a 1960s project, right? So I think like you need that kind of diversity, just as we need biodiversity, you need also spatial diversity and diversity in cities. So I think that could be also one of the kind of value propositions of an alternative platform. And then obviously access is an important one, right? Or ownership as well.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Just to quickly just answer the question on my end too. I think it is, as you mentioned, Jill, at the very end, it is really the question of the difference of this versus the modernist prefabricated kind of agenda about parts and pre-made parts, like the question of metabolism, or like it becomes a geopolitical question. It becomes really related to the where you're implementing this agenda. So I think for me, the answer seems to be platform on my end, but it's really what platform and how smart it becomes, or how diverse or diversified or hybridized it becomes. That's really the part that is making it almost undoable at this point with the current way of looking into platforms. So I think it should be somewhere between, and That's more or less what I'm interested in. A bigger picture, it should be somewhere between a design software and platform. So I think it should have some liberations or agencies or possibilities of a free design software, like with freedom, so you can create, but then it should be more or less guided with logistical and pragmatic kind of guidelines and agendas, rather than suggesting a design or like in a communist way of producing self-similar housings or self-similar kind of elements.
I would agree with that, right? Like it's also, I think the rejection of universality is very important.
Exactly.
Like I mean, it's kind of crazy in a way that almost globally, our living spaces are traded with the same types, right? It's like a studio, a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a loft. It's incredible. I mean, like there are so many different lifestyles and ways that people want to live, but we have to kind of put ourselves either in some of those commodified kind of types, right? And I think that's a kind of like that's also why you could argue that like we still live in a way in a kind of a modernist time, right? I mean, we kind of universally kind of live in the same kind of plasterboarded apartment types that come from this kind of catalogs and that are impossible to question, right? Like I mean, if you like that's the kind of frustrating thing with housing is like, especially also if you're a student, it's like it seems to be utopian to think that we could change housing, right? Like the moment that your corridor is like half a meter too wide, you fail your housing project in school, right? Because it's like this is not possible. You cannot question that. It's a bit like like Slavoj Žižek and Jameson. They have this statement that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? You cannot question capitalism. It's easier to say the world will just like explode. It's the same with housing. I mean, like you cannot question housing as it is today. You can design like whatever, right? You can design like a flying space station. You can design a concert hall that like, floats and has cantilevers of 200 meters, but you cannot change, with housing, you cannot, right? It's because it's so intrinsically tied to capital anyway.
And just a quick side note, I think we have more questions on Brandon's end, but I think that's one of the exciting things about the discrete conversation, right? Because I think, I mean, you're proposing it more in sometimes in a conventional way of, slabs, and I mean, even though they're not slabs and
not
columns,
slabs.
they are not, I know, but like,
Freudian lapses,
yeah, spatially organizing and speaking. But I think the possibility of, that I often think about them, or I think I mentioned it to you also, I often think about them as pre-programmed blocks that bring some agency to the game, and then from there it's really open to kind of, even you can do I would argue you can do a surface project. It is a really loose off argument, but technically you can. So you can really think about kind of like unifying the platform. So I think that for me as an audience, that's really an interesting part of the discrete conversation, that it's, and that's why I asked about the cropping part, because I think it's just enough in a sense that it is not by far, like a metabolist kind of approach of, proposing something and kind of like going with it. And it is not really all about customizing and kind of, let's do whatever we want, each one of us.
It's like, I mean, like ultimately, I do would say like it is ultimately all about customizing, right? And like that's the difficulty that, the discrete is not dialectically opposed to either like modernism or the digital. Like the difference is, and it's key actually, the reference to metabolism. Like if you think about Kurokawa's tower, that's saying like one human, one box, right? And every human gets the same box. It's a universal, like that's the kind of the modernist project, right? And then what the discrete is actually saying that because parts have no function, it can never be one human, one part, because you cannot inhabit the part, right? So it's basically, and then between the parts you could create something that is, in a way unique for every human. So I would argue that it's actually the most kind of customized. It's way more customized in a way than a surface project. I mean, with a surface project, you have one object that is always the same, right? You can only follow the surface project. You can only pull it. But like with a discrete project, you can do like a Swiss grid if you want to. You can be Chipperfield, but you can also be like do a kind of Greg Lynn like fluid space in principle. So it has a kind of a very large, I think, freedom in terms of like defining positions of authorship and interest within that paradigm.
It has the platform qualities already embedded. I would say. Sorry,
Yeah.
Brandon.
No, I apologize for interrupting the conversation. But we have two more questions I want to get from the students, or we'll really have one more question, but I'm going to combine them into two for sake of time. But this comes from Denver and Caden, and they're asking kind of about, again, I'm kind of piecing these together as we're saying it, but they're asking, what is the extent that you guys both see this kind of idea of discrete and structures being either altered or changed over time? And I think this is an interesting kind of question for both of you guys is, how do you guys kind of view your work in the discrete kind of over the discourse of time, right? And what, again, maybe back to like we're talking about metabolist, right? The idea of building off of these things or further like extension of these things. So again, I think an interesting question for both you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like, so I mean, obviously, as the parts are independent of the whole, it implies that you could take it apart again, right? So there's that notion of circularity. I mean, I would not, I mean, we're doing like now in the Bartlett a lot of research agendas actually with moving parts, which is something that 10 years ago I absolutely was totally against, right? I was like, what? Like moving architecture is like, it's terrible, right? It's like, but now, I mean, we kind of got interested in a very minimalist version of an adaptive architecture. So it's not like kind of a crazy choreography, but it's super minimal, right? It's just one of those blocks is a robot and it just positions itself to either open or close a wall, for example. Like if you have two apartments and one part is actually not fixed, but it's robotic, you could decide to share or not share something that then could be connected to, a timetable or a schedule in your phone, or like a kind of, Tinder-like app where you're making decisions on like whether you want to share or who you want to share or rent it to. So we're working on some of those kind of aspects that there could be kind of modifications modifications in the part relations over time to enable kind of really new ways of using spaces, right? That spaces would be kind of reconfigured. And I know that sounds terrible to many people. If you can't see the project, you're like, this is wrong. But it's actually quite interesting, I think. And then I mean, of course, like there's also, I think, more broadly an argument. If you think about time-based notions in discreteness, I think there is an argument that, of course, buildings could be kind of very slowly either being taken away and reassembled into another building, and that's something we're doing also with the tech with automated architecture. We have actually assembled and reassembled projects multiple times, just kind of using the same elements multiple times, so they kind of have a different journey. Sometimes they like a hero part as like part of a column carrying an entire kind of massive load, and another time they have a kind of humble life as a little bench in the next project. And again, like there's a huge amount of kind of research and questions there.
So again, just a quick answer also on my end. I think for me, I mean, I totally agree with what Gilles is suggesting in terms of, probably the development of discrete, but I would probably get a little bit of distance yet from the discrete conversation, because I don't think I yet belong to that. But I think just in a way, thinking about part to part to whole relationship in a controlled way, I think that would be my take. I'm really, as I explained briefly, I'm interested in, and I think it would become more and more crucial to think about platforms that are not necessarily like liberating the platforms or democratic platforms in a sense. So I think that there is a missed part of the puzzle that is kind of sitting between the software interface, which is for experienced and professional user, and all of a sudden a kind of a mediocre kind of naive platform. So I think there is a missed component in between that is really, again, I often compare it to game design, but in a conceptual way, which is you have a field that you can do whatever you want within that field. And you can, I mean, if you think about a first-person game, you can jump, you can just do whatever you want, go all the way to the edges of the city, but you cannot go beyond. So I see really more or less like that. You can really have a life as a designer, as a second designer, which is more or less like a design software platform, without having the issues or the need for learning all the technicalities. of being a kind of technician or a technical user of the software. So I think for me, it's really about more augmenting the platforms to become design softwares and simplifying design softwares to become more of a platform in a sense.
Fantastic. So I think, due to time, I know it's getting late over there in London for Gilles. We'll have to sadly kind of wrap this talk up a little bit. But again, thank you guys so much for coming out. I want to pass the mic over to Director Bernal if you want to say any final comments, and then we can kind of start wrapping up.
Actually, I wanted to ask one more question. It's super interesting, Gilles and Ebrahim, to see the two of you. But before we wrap it up, Gilles, one thing that keeps crossing my mind is that some people could make the claim that architecture happens somewhere in the latency between representation and realization of a project. There's that time in between in which there's the promise of what could be and the promise, and then the actual execution of what is. And what I find really interesting about the project, the script project and your project in particular, is the flattening of those two, in which to some degree the representation becomes the realization, and there's kind of like the removal due to efficiency or to just go to the very basics of what it is, that I could understand the realization of the project through just looking at the representation. And I don't know if that's a way that for you to frame this, as far as if architecture is moving beyond that role of representation as the promise and it's moving into the realization. The representation is really the realization of the system, or if you have ever thought about it that way.
No, I think that's, I mean, beautifully framed, and I think that touches on, a lot of the kind of issues relating to the discrete, because it's true. I mean, I think flattening is the right term, right? It flattens the difference between, what is kind of the concept and the reality, if you want to use that kind of binary, or between the digital and the physical, then to kind of get back to Ebrahim's conversation as well. It flattens that, right? Like the assumption is that there is no translation between the two, that they are kind of the same process. And it removes that kind of, in a way, that transition that, is at the core of our profession, right? Like our profession comes, like, you're saying, from the Albertian ideas that you removed from the construction, and that architecture is in the kind of the notation, right? As Mario Carpo would then also argue for. And it also hits back a bit at, when I kind of very briefly spoke about, in the talk I was showing Toyo Ito's like U House, and kind of saying that, I can't do that anymore, right? And I actually saw someone in the YouTube chat was also asking, like, does Gilles, like, does he think it's actually an advantage to like look at architecture the way you do? And it's true. I mean, I feel a bit like, on the one hand, a bit disabled, right? That I cannot do that anymore. I cannot look at these things without kind of wanting to flatten it, right? And so in a way, it's kind of like, it's almost dumb, right? That you're kind of getting rid of that kind of layer of abstraction. Because if you look at the U House, it's a project of that kind of, what you're saying, like this kind of latency, right? It would be a napkin sketch. It would be a kind of the trace of a pen that then, has an idea behind it. And then you would have to go through the translation of that idea to either like a timber frame or a series of bricks or pouring concrete, right? And it's true, I can't do that, right? It's not there anymore. And on the one hand, I think on the one hand, I'm obviously, a bit sad about that because I mentioned it in my lecture, right? On the other hand, it's deeply fascinating, right? Because I mean, I don't want to be, and I think that's in the tension between when I'm showing the work from the design tech startup and, my own work, is that there is that tension, right? And that I don't want to kind of, do a project that is just a Lego project, and like that's, I think, what is kind of, for me as an architect, I could not just do a Lego project, like, for sure not. So I'm somewhere like in a kind of ambiguous zone between feeling attracted to that kind of the idea of like the napkin sketch, and then the idea of like the potency of that kind of Lego block. So that kind of required in a way kind of a split, I mean, in my personality, to kind of do these two things at the same time. And I would kind of argue that, like, that's a kind of the dangerous, I think the one that maybe is a question for all of us as architects, right? It's like, maybe it's our weakness that we want to keep doing that kind of napkin sketch, right? That we feel, and I feel deeply attracted to that, right? That, I mean, maybe that's what prevents us from doing these platforms, right? Like no one wants to do, you know, a Capterra, right? But at the same time, we need to do a Capterra. Like we need to be doing that. But it's a very different world. So I mean, like I think the kind of the napkin sketch and that kind of the latency you're mentioning is kind of our weakness and also kind of the beauty, right, of kind of our profession. So I think that tension is kind of there to remain. I mean, at least in my world, it will be always there, I guess, as long as I have the kind of the two companies.
Ebrahim, I don't know if you want to comment back on that.
I mean,
because to that degree, your project kind of like flips that, and it gives the promise of disguising what it could be through the mediums, right? So
yeah, exactly.
There's so many layers in between that you have to read through the layers to try to come to a conclusion of what it could be, right? So there's a lot of input from the viewer to be able to visualize it.
Yeah, so I think on my end, like I think I would break down your question to two things. One is like kind of you know, arguing about the presence of digital and physical as a separate thing, and then about representation and the artifact. So I think for me, these two are kind of two different things. So maybe I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily pushing for the difference between, you know, the representation and the kind of the reality of something. So I think on my end, it is also similar to what Gilles was proposing, that they almost become one thing. But I think I am more interested, maybe I'm less optimistic in a sense. I am really kind of like thinking about each of them like digital and physical in a separate way. So whenever I don't, at the bottom of my heart, I don't really believe that they can become one. So I feel this friction between them all the time. And then I think I live through that friction, or I live right at that friction where they meet. So I look at it more as a collision rather than fusion, if it makes sense. So and I live at that the moment of collision where one becomes the other or the other way around. So in a sense, I think I would also say, I would also argue that there is no necessarily, like Robabel project probably was the better example of this, that there is no distinction between, I would change your terminology a little bit on mine, like the platform and the artifact or the outcome of the platform. So between the UI that I'm proposing and the UX that I want to be experienced. Again, because the Robabel is the thing itself, and then the outcome of it is, again, the thing itself. But between digitality and physicality, for me, I think there is still this dialectic. Might be one of my, you know, beloved binaries. I don't know, but I think I'm still enjoying counting them super separated and kind of trying to get the productive friction between them. Because in a sense, I think at some point we will get to the point that the boundary becomes more and more blurred. But at this point, I think that the difference between the qualities of each is tremendously huge. So I'm not talking again about the application, but the quality that the digital environment produces and the restrictions that the physical environment you know, brings with it. I think that is too big for me at this point to try to bridge that into one homogeneous kind of you know, one kind of fused mixture.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Brendan. I hope, Gilles, Ebrahim, you continue this conversation offline, but in the future. And Gilles, we hope to see you here at Kent State sometime soon. Everybody have a good night and enjoy the rest of the night. Bye.
Great.
Thank you so much, guys, for hosting.
Thank you, Gilles. Take
Bye.
care. Oh, thank you, Brandon.
Toodaloo until next time. Also, for everyone who's on here, last second for the YouTube, next Wednesday, we have Nick Safely joining us with another Faculty and Friends. So really excited. Have a good night.